Hi everyone. So this week's this week's Torah portion is Yitro, and it's the Torah portion where the Jewish people received the Torah. It's been 3 months since they left Egypt, and the Torah tells us that in the third month this process begins. They reach Mount Sinai, and this is when they're about to receive the Torah. It says B'chodesh HaShlishi, in the third month, and the Sfat Emet, Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Leib Walter, Hasidic commentary on the Torah we've talked about a few times here. He comments on this phrase B'chodesh HaShlishi, in the third month, and he says that this is a hint to the idea that this is actually the third new thing that's coming into being, the new thing coming into reality. We've said before how the word for chodesh, month, is related to the word chadash, new. So b'chodesh HaShlishi, in the third month, can also be understood to mean that this is a kind of third newness, third new thing. And so the Sfat Emet says that this is a hint to this idea that the giving of the Torah is the third real and new thing coming into the world. What are the other two? The first is the creation of the world. This is the first new thing that comes into being, is the world itself. The second really new thing that gets revealed or comes into the world happens at the Exodus from Egypt, when the Jewish people leave Egypt. And the third is the giving of the Torah. So this is really interesting. It's interesting that these two things, these last two things, the leaving Egypt and receiving the Torah, compared to the creation of the world, that's how new they are. That's how revolutionary and world reality changing they are. So how is that? What is this newness that comes into the world at each of these stages? How are these things each so unique? And what does this represent? So interestingly, if we look at creation, the coming into being of the world, there are Hasidic teachings about tzimtzum, the idea of divine contraction, a kind of Kabbalistic idea that relates to how God created the world, that God needed to contract himself in some sense in order for there to be space for the world to be created. Otherwise, God's divine light would take up all the space in some sense. It's all-encompassing, and so there's no space for anything else to be. And there are different ways of understanding tzimtzum, divine contraction, and a kind of more Hasidic approach, and specifically the Chabad approach, understands divine contraction as, in some sense, an illusion. Really, God doesn't ever contract himself. God's light is always everywhere, before creation and after creation. And the only real change that happens from before creation to after creation is that there's a kind of illusion of contraction. There's a kind of illusion that God isn't everywhere and everything. And that's what allows the world to come into being. That's what allows there to be a perspective, a kind of experience of the world as separate from God and as a kind of self-standing thing, or a realm of things. And so on this kind of picture, the creation of the world is actually a revelation. It's not a fundamental change from there being nothing to there being something. Rather, it's a kind of revelation of something that was there in potential, but that wasn't visible because God's light was so all-encompassing. And then from the kind of perspective that God creates that allows the world to come into being, it's a perspective from which God's light is hidden in certain ways. And so then the world, the kind of potential objects can come into being, or can be experienced as separate from God. So that's a kind of way of seeing creation as a revelation, rather than just as a completely new thing coming into being. And so then we can see a kind of fundamental similarity between the three things that the Sfat Emet tells us are new: the creation of the world, and the Exodus from Egypt, and the receiving of the Torah. Because in each case, there's something completely new that's revealed. There's a kind of new revelation of something that wasn't visible before, wasn't accessible before. So first it's the world. The existence of the world itself was not visible, wasn't accessible, wasn't revealed before creation. And when the Jewish people leave Egypt, there's a kind of revelation of God's relationship to the world. So before it wasn't obvious, it wasn't visible, at least on a kind of grand public scale. It wasn't visible that God was involved in reality, that God was involved in people's lives, that there was a kind of relationship between God and the world, and God and individual people, and God and the Jewish people, a relationship that continued after creation. There was a kind of there was a philosophical view that was common to think that maybe there was a God that created the world, but then he left it alone, and it just kind of continued to exist on its own with the laws of nature guiding it. But at Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt, what's being revealed here is that no, God is constantly in relationship with the world. God is constantly involved in everything that happens in the world, every aspect of nature, every aspect of what happens here, as revealed by the 10 plagues. God reveals that actually he's in charge of all of it, he's behind all of it, he's involved in all of it, and that he has a special relationship with us. There's a kind of real relationship between God and the world, and between God and the Jewish people, between God and individual people. So this idea of God's involvement, God's relationship to us and to the world, was a kind of completely new thing that was revealed at the Exodus from Egypt. It was something that wasn't accessible in this kind of big public way until then. And then what's the new thing that's getting revealed at the giving of the Torah? So the Sfat Emet talks about how the Torah is the internality of the world. It's the soul of the world. It's kind of what the world is on the inside. There's a midrash, a teaching of our sages, that says that the Torah existed before the world was created, and that God looked into the Torah to create the world. The Torah was a kind of blueprint for the creation of the world. It's not something that comes into being afterwards or just describes the way things are here. It's actually, it's at the core of the nature of the world. And so the Sfat Emet tells us it's the internality, it's the soul of the world. What does that mean? I think if we look to another verse in this process of the giving of the Torah, the receiving of the Torah, we can see another hint, and that's the verse where the Jewish people have heard God's voice. They hear God actually reveal himself and speak, at least the beginning of the 10 Commandments, and the Torah tells us that that the whole nation sees the voices, sees the sounds. So what does that mean? That's mysterious, that they saw the sounds rather than hearing the sounds. And the Sfat Emet comments on this language. He actually notes that it's also in the present tense. It's not that they saw the voices or the sounds, it's that they see. And so he says that they kind of accessed a perspective from which the past, the present, and the future were all together. They were all one. And in this idea of seeing sounds, this kind of synesthesia of seeing what's usually heard or hearing what's usually seen, there's a kind of hint to the idea that the things that seem separate, we think kind of on the surface level that there are all these separate objects and separate channels and separate ways of relating to things. There's vision and there's hearing, and those are separate. There's this object and there's that object, and they're separate. But here, if there's a way of seeing sounds, then that tells us that no, actually these things that seem separate on the outside, they're not really separate on the inside. They're all interconnected. And this is something that we can see also in research in neuroscience. We see that actually vision and hearing and all the other sense modalities, they influence each other. And what, at the end of the day, what we experience is not really isn't really coming in only through separate channels. Even if it comes in separately at the beginning, it already gets integrated at very early stages of our cognitive processing. And so what we hear and what we see is in some sense, on a certain level, already starts to get processed together. But here we're kind of seeing a hint to the idea that actually if we go even deeper, deep down at the internality of things and into the ultimate nature of things, everything is much more interconnected than we realize. On the surface level, things seem separate, and at the internal plane, at the root, things are actually connected. Things are one. What's usually heard can be seen, and what's usually seen can be heard, and our experience can encompass something much wider than we usually realize. And so I think if we kind of put these ideas together, you might think that what's being revealed at the giving of the Torah, what's the real newness there? What's being revealed that is so fundamentally different from what was accessible before, from what was available to us before? That's this kind of access to the internal plane at which everything is unified. So that reality was always there. The Torah as a blueprint for the world predated the world's existence in some sense. But a kind of access to that is something that was revealed only at the giving of the Torah. At the giving of the Torah, we suddenly had a way to kind of go from our outer lives where things seem separate, or it seems like there's lots of different things and lots of different channels, and we can kind of from there go connect to an inner plane where everything is actually interconnected. And we see this when we study the Torah. When we study the Talmud, for example, you see that it's really impossible to study any topic in the Talmud without encountering so many other different topics. Examples are brought from all different areas, and you sort of have to be familiar with many, many, many different areas in order to understand any one area in depth. So you see this kind of interconnection and like things being quoted and used as proofs from one area to another area, and you see that it's all interwoven. And so it's a kind of access point, or a kind of channel that takes something that's external. It takes our external lives and the details of our external lives, and it's a kind of it's something that we encounter externally when we first start learning, or we first encounter the Torah. But actually, it's a channel that takes us inward, and it connects us to a plane where everything is interconnected, where everything is much more unified than we realize. And so that is perhaps the newness that's coming into the world, that's getting revealed, that was completely inaccessible in this way before. We couldn't really access that inner plane where everything was interconnected, and now we're kind of given a tool that lets us access it to go from the outside to the inside and access this inner plane by way of this tool that's given to us on an outer plane. And I think it can be a reminder to us also in our lives. Like, we think that all these different things are going on in our lives. Like, we have our work, and we have our family life, and we have this and that, and we have tons of things on our plate. And it can sometimes feel like they're all separate. But if we look deeper, sometimes we can see patterns and relationships and connections between different things that are going on in our lives, and the ways that things influence each other that are not always immediately obvious to us, but once we start looking deeper, we can recognize them. And so it can be a reminder that the channels that seem separate are kind of like our work channel, our family channel, our whatever channels we have, whatever things are going on in our lives that seem separate. On a kind of internal plane, we can come to a place where we can see the sounds, we can see a kind of picture that from where things are unified, where things are interconnected, where one realm really influences another, and they're not actually so separate as we thought after all. So I wish us all that kind of access, and for the healing and kind of like settledness of mind and calm that can come from that kind of realization.